and we're really excited for today. And we all kind of work in our little bubble of Indiana, and I know some consultants, are working in different states, but sometimes it can kind of feel like we might have like a narrow perspective. And so we're really lucky today to have David Clark, which is Federal Highways Federal Preservation Officer, and Mandy Ranslow with the Advisory Council and Federal Highways Liaison. And thank you all both for joining us. And this is a great opportunity for us in Indiana to have you all share some of those broader perspectives for what's going on in the country. And, that just really only helps us do our jobs better. And just for, some perspective of this group, we have these virtual chats about once a month, every other month. And it's a collection of Federal Highway, Indiana Division, INDOT Cultural Resources Office staff, SHPO, tribes, consultants, and some other folks from across the state who join in. And we keep it really informal and loose. And it's just really, we developed it during COVID, just when we had the technology available finally. Then that's when we thought, like, hey, we can reach out a lot more and talk to people more than we used to. And so that's really the roots of this. And so we did kind of develop some questions just to kind of guide the conversation, but we really hope that the folks that are participating, chime in and ask your own questions, because this really is a good opportunity for us to hear from the ACHP and Federal Highway headquarters folks to help us do our jobs. And so I'll start off. Effective interagency communication and collaboration can be challenging. And the same can be said for, the relationship between agencies and consultants. And, we have different perspectives, priorities, and personalities. A lot of this, sometimes it is a personality-driven relationship. Can you describe the relationship between the working relationship between the Advisory Council and Federal Highway, and what your experiences have taught you about effective and respectful relationships?
So I'll start, and I want to say a big hello to Indiana. Mandy and I are excited to be here. I am David Clark. I'm the Federal Preservation Officer for the Federal Highway Administration and Headquarters. And in my capacity as the FPO, I have agency-wide oversight on the Federal Highway Administration's compliance with Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act. In addition to that, and because of that, I also oversee our compliance with 4F and tribal consultation for the agency. Mandy, they said it first, so I'll warn you, they're recording this event, so we got to be careful what we say here because we're on record.
And we put it on YouTube.
But I'll start with a little anecdote for those of you that do not know. Many years ago, almost 15 years ago, I moved into the cubicle office where Patrick used to work at the Delaware Department of Transportation. So I had his little cubicle when I took a job there 15 years ago, and he left Delaware. So we do have a connection that most people aren't aware of. We didn't work together, but I do remember that little cubicle I had. So it's good to see you again and everybody here.
Yeah, and offline and another time, we have a lot of stories we can share about people we know in common. So,
so about your question, I'll take a stab at it and then I'll hand it over to Mandy. So much of Section 106 is consultation, and relationship building is so imperative. And one of the big mantras that Mandy and I inherited from our predecessors, Mary Ann Neighbor, who was the FPO, and Carol Lagarde, who was at the Advisory Council, had a certain type of relationship that Mandy and I have continued. And what we talk to our division offices in the Federal Highway Administration, our state DOTs, consultants, and 106 consulting parties, tribes, SHPOs, TIPOs, is the fact that between our two federal agencies, if we can get along and agree to disagree when we have to in Washington at the highest level and have a positive working relationship, then you at the local level, SHPOs, TIPOs, state DOTs, consultants, should also be able to have that collegial relationship to work in a positive manner to deliver projects for infrastructure for the Federal Highway Administration. So many times, Mandy and I come to a place and we see challenges and opportunities. We see challenging relationships, especially between DOT, SHPOs, TIPOs, consulting parties, tribes. And we're surprised because, hey, if we can, work it out at our end at the highest level in Washington, then you should be able to. And we really try to promote that and foster the foundation of Section 106 consultation is all about relationships. And you have to have good, solid relationships, and you have to be able to communicate. And you have to be able to agree to disagree at times and still move forward. And that's a big thing we promote. It's important. And, right now in, Indiana, we're in Indiana. We have currently an eligibility determination dispute in Indiana on a mid-20th century historic district, and we're going to the keeper of the National Register. It's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. It can help set precedents. It can help, answer a question that you ask 10 people, you get 10 different answers. You could flip a coin on it. So, these are the things that we want to promote in terms of having those good communication and relationships to promote effective project delivery.
Yeah, David, I would definitely agree with that. And I think, I think at the core of it is trust and compromise, right? I mean, this room knows, and I don't need to lecture you, the procedural nature of 106. It doesn't demand an outcome. So, sometimes we have to find ways to compromise when we don't agree. And then, at the worst case, like David was saying, you elevate things for eligibility disputes or effect disputes. But honestly, we see that pretty rarely. We do see the states finding ways to move forward either through, informal dispute resolution or just, continuing consultation until you can get to somewhere where everybody can agree. But, the relationship building is what's really important. The messiest things that we see, and I'm not going to, name states or pick on anybody, but is, when there isn't a good relationship, when there isn't trust already, and, building those relationships, outside of just the project consultation is really important as well. And, we see different DOTs, and I'm sure you guys do it too, larger, tribal consultation meetings about broad topics or, things like that can really do a lot to start building relationships and allowing some trust to form between consulting parties and the agencies.
Yeah,
Great,
good points.
thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
So one of the big pieces of news recently, I don't know if you've heard about this, but there was an infrastructure bill that was passed. So, that obviously is going to have ramifications for all of us. And we're interested in hearing both of you, your perspectives on what your key takeaways are and how you think it might impact us here on the state level.
Okay. So let me be careful here. Hold on to the seat of your pants. And I'll speak to a number of tenets of what I can say today because it's over 2,200 pages. So we've locked up a few people in rooms for 30 days to try and read and digest it, but we're still interpreting, what's there. So there's not much. There's certain things I can say and certain things that I'm not able to say. But what I can say is, It is the largest infusion of federal funds in almost 50 years since the interstate under the Eisenhower administration. But I'll be clear on a few talking points that we are promoting nationally. A lot of people started, we use the acronyms. We had MAP 21, we had the FAST Act, Safety Lou, and who remembers Ice-T? This initially was called IJA. Don't say IJA. That's not the right acronym. Then it became BID. I won't say BID. The term we're using right now and what we're promoting is BILL, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So use BILL. Call it the bill, Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The bill does a number of things different and new that are going to have implications for our wheelhouse of Section 106 compliance, and then inherently 4F and tribal consultation, other things. But a couple of takeaways are that the general federal funding mechanism stream, and by that I mean the federal financial apportionment that goes to each state, is still the same. It's a little bit more money, but that doesn't change any. So the states will still get a chunk of federal money that the state determines through their STIP and their TIP how they want to spend that money. So that's still the same. It's just a little more money. The big difference is, and this is important, discretionary grants. The amount of money in discretionary grants is off the charts. It is huge. And those are things that normally we would see as infra grant, raise grant, build grant, TAP, which used to be TE money, TAP money, TTP money for projects on tribal lands. So the discretionary grant program now has more categories, and I don't even have the acronyms yet. And the new and existing categories, those pots of money have doubled, tripled, quadrupled to where a huge portfolio, a huge component of your state DOT's portfolio will be in the discretionary grant arena, which also means locally administered projects are going to balloon because you're going to have CLGs, counties, cities, and local project sponsors who can go after that discretionary grant money. So you need to be prepared for how your locally administered program is going to increase exponentially, how your state program will increase exponentially for discretionary grant programs, and know that some of them are, how do I say this carefully? Designed to allow almost any project. For example, there's a new discretionary grant program that basically, and I don't know the acronym yet, but it basically says, if your bridge is structurally deficient and functionally obsolete, here's a blank check to build a new bridge. So bridge rehabilitation and bridge replacement projects are not going to be scrutinized per se because the money is so much, and that's such a purpose and need slam dunk. It's functionally obsolete. It's structurally deficient. Here's your check to go replace that bridge or rehab that bridge. Existing infrastructure will take precedence over new infrastructure, with the goal being, let's fix and rebuild everything that's old and broken before we start adding new capacity. That's why when I look at the scope and landscape of the nation, we are going to be knee deep in historic bridge rehabs and replacements for the next 5 to 7 years, because the way the discretionary grant programs are, if it's functionally obsolete or structurally deficient, you automatically can get the money to fix the bridge. So I see a huge focus in our arena on historic bridge projects and more on maintenance and repair. There will be new infrastructure, but it will be much quicker and easier to get the money to rehabilitate, repair, maintenance and replace existing infrastructure. And that's at a very 30,000-foot quick high level of what I'm seeing. There are still a lot of unknowns because we're interpreting the 2,200-page law, and there will be a ton more coming out. I recommend you stay tuned to this winter's TRB meeting, where there will be information. Even if you can't get to Washington, there's going to be some virtual components, I think. But stay tuned with ACHP. Oh, it's not SCOE anymore. I don't know what it's called now, but whatever the ACHP committee. Who? Somebody call out the acronym. What's it called now? It's not SCOE. Anybody? All right. Well, whatever SCOE
I believe
was.
it's the Committee on Environment and Sustainability.
Committee on Environments. Okay, that committee. Stay tuned to them. Stay tuned into TRB, because honestly, knowing how the government operates, you may get stuff from them quicker and more often than before you get formal guidance and policy directly from the Federal Highway Administration. And the last thing I'll say on this is that which may placate a little bit in Indiana, but there's a lot more discretionary grant money for projects on tribal lands. So projects on tribal lands have a much bigger pot and multiple pots of money to draw from to improve infrastructure as well as rural broadband access. The whole thing with electric charging stations for electric vehicles, I'm not too concerned about in the 106 world, because it's basically putting electric chargers in rest areas on the interstate, and those are usually low-hanging fruit for us. So that's not a big thing for me per se. I'm more concerned about the quantity and glut of historic bridges we're going to have to deal with. But that is another big component, is the electric charging stations.
And I could see with historic. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Mandy.
Well, I was just gonna say, I share David's concern certainly with the uptick in bridge projects we're probably going to have, but honestly, and I'm not saying this is necessarily specifically to Indiana, but in general, I will say some of the more tricky projects David and I have dealt with are ones that are administered by the local agencies, not by the DOT directly. And I think, while I'm trying not to freak out too much about it, that's where I'm a little nervous that we might have some Section 106 hangups where, you might have some really well-meaning municipalities and counties that, want to go after this money, but their town and our county engineers probably don't really know what Section 106 compliance is. So that's where we end up in some hot water over some otherwise small budget projects. So, I don't know if over the next 5 to 7 years, we want to start thinking about, how to triage some of that. I know some of the programmatic agreements we've been negotiating in some states have been flirting with the idea of including their local agency programs within it. But obviously then that puts a burden on DOT resources who don't always have a ton of staff to do this kind of work too. So, I'm not freaking out, but that's kind of what's in the back of my head about this whole infrastructure bill.
Well, Anthony works with the local projects, so he might have a lot to say about that and think about that. But on the historic bridges aspect, I could see too, when sponsors, get this money, it's like, hey, we got this money, we're going to jump right to replacement. Like we're just going to go right. We got this money. We don't have to worry about this other stuff. So I think, that's where we'll have a lot of work on our end too, to kind of walk folks through that. There is a process. We have alternatives and now, we do all these things. It's not straight to replacement. And I think I saw Mary. Mary, do you want to chime in? Oh, so Mary is our historic bridge specialist, and she said, how does the fact that we have a programmatic agreement for historic bridges come into play? And we're still using it, correct?
Yeah, you'll be using it more often, and if we need to tweak it or amend it, we can do that. But it works good. It's a really good one. Indiana's and Louisiana are two of the best in the country for their historic bridge PAs, so it'll just keep being utilized. Another thing that's come up that you need to be aware of, that I'm still wrapping my head around. The bill provides us with a ton of money, and we're just a big fat checkbook. That's really all we are. Give this money out. Make sure you spend it the right way. What it does not do, it does not allow currently funding to increase the capacity at SHPOs and TIPOs. So we're giving you guys a lot more money, but we're not saying you can go hire a ton more people at SHPO and pay for that out of the bill. So another concern is, as much as I'm able to ramp up and provide assistance to keep myself working at the federal level, and our division offices and our state DOTs can do that, there's a huge concern that SHPOs and TIPOs are not going to be able to keep up. And how do we ameliorate that? How do we think about liaisons? How do we think about the 106 process not being held up on the federal end or the state end, but at the resource agency end at the SHPO or TIPO? And you need to be having the forethought now to think about, do I have a liaison? Do I want a liaison? Do I want more liaisons? Do I want to negotiate some new things with SHPO, TIPO? How is their digitization? Is everything electronic? How is the submission process? What are the gap analysis that needs to get done that could hold things up? If you go to the SHPO and say, this year we got 15 historic bridge projects. Like, whoa, are they prepared for that? Are they not? How can we? So that's something that the states need to be thinking about, because I do see, and I've been hearing a concern about this from SHPOs and NIC SHPO and TIPOs and NATHPO.
Well, yeah, I think that's definitely, a concern here too. And I feel like sometimes we're often in a situation where we're just dealing with the churn of projects, and we're kind of unable to take that moment to stop and take a step back and think more about process and what we can do to implement more efficient processes down the road, so that we don't keep digging deeper and deeper. And so one of the things that Patrick mentioned is I do local projects here, so I'm definitely familiar with what you were talking about, Mandy. The added complexities of working on a local project, where you have maybe projects that are lower budget, but you have projects that involve locals who don't have a ton of familiarity. So the process, it does involve that kind of education and partnership, and it just adds another perspective to the equation. You got not just the DOT and the SHPO and Federal Highway, and now have the project sponsors different. One of the things that kind of came up to me or came to mind when I was listening to you talk is also, we often run into issues with pedestrian-focused projects, multimodal projects that involve trails, and from, I think, an outsider's perspective, oftentimes one might think that those projects would be just naturally kind of easier, because they're not a big new highway or they're not an interstate project. But oftentimes they're pretty complicated when it comes to potentially impacting historic properties. Putting a trail through 19th century, downtown could raise a lot of questions. So first question, I guess, related to that is it my understanding that, there may be a lot of increased funding for multimodal projects within the bill? And do you have any advice for approaching those projects particularly?
So, yes, I'll talk about the bill, and I'll ask Mandy to talk about advice on how to handle that. Yes, another huge bunch of discretionary pots of money are for, and I said, previously, TAP, which was TAP projects, but the whole, rails to trails. You got a rail to trail, funded, go. You want to make your downtown ADA compliant, automatically funded, go. Bike ped facilities, a huge pot of money for making things bike ped friendly, pedestrian, multimodal. Safe routes to school. That's a no-brainer, slam dunk. I don't want kids getting squashed crossing the street to get to school. Funded, go. So there is a ton of money for those, less complex, win-win, low dollar figure type of projects. But in our wheelhouse, those can be very problematic. Not problematic, sorry, very challenging. Because a lot of them are in suburban or urban historic districts. And how do we handle, downtown Main Street becoming ADA compliant? And I've got, early 20th century brick sidewalks and a whole bunch of other aesthetic things in the district that I've got to deal with and worry about. Huge challenge. And it's stuff you should be thinking about, especially if it's a locally administered project. And those locally administered projects have no idea about the complexities of 106 when they're trying to make downtown ADA compliant or increase the pedestrian multimodal facilities. So yes, there's lots of money for that. It is going to be a big component. And I think a lot of education and training will be important for the state DOTs to have on hand to provide that to the local agencies that may be delivering projects. But, some of the challenges we've seen recently are, especially in downtown historic districts, where that threshold or bar is set between a no adverse effect and an adverse effect when, well, I'm just putting in sidewalks. Well, I'm just putting in sidewalks and new street lighting and signs everywhere and benches. You're pushing that envelope into that. That's a gray, subjective, line that we struggle with a lot of times. And in addition to that, and this probably will come up in the conversation later today, and I said it, I danced on it previously, today, mid-20th century architecture. There is going to be a ton of multimodal projects that potentially are going to have issues with mid-20th century architecture. What constitutes a district versus are these mid-20th century architectural properties even eligible? That is still an amorphous monster we're struggling with nationally. I can say, though, currently I'm engaged with TRB in an NCHRP study that is looking at mid-20th century commercial architecture. And when that product comes out, I think it will be a huge benefit. It's a companion to the mid-20th century residential product that NCHRP put out through TRB a few years ago. And I think that will be a help, but it's still something that we're struggling with. And Indiana is in a place in the Midwest where you have so much of this stuff, and you need to be prepared on how to handle that from a contextual standpoint, as well as a quantitative standpoint, because it's going to be relevant to all your projects moving forward. But the short answer is yes, there is a lot of discretionary grant money for these types of projects. And I'll ask Mandy to opine on, best practices or what the council's thoughts are on how we look at these and deal with them.
Yeah, we don't have, like an official stance. So to be, clear, like my advice is just, coming out of my brain. I don't want to necessarily misrepresent this, but, David, I was thinking about, for instance, there was a state where we were having some angst with like ADA sidewalk ramps. And one of our recommendations to them was, aside from working on it just on a project by project basis between the DOT and the SHPO, we recommended that maybe they start discussing like standard treatments or designs for what these ADA ramps could look like in a historic district. And I understand that every historic district is a little different, but if there could be some consensus that then they could provide to designers who are hired by either the towns or the counties or whoever, then they would have like an idea of what direction to take it in. And that more likely would be a no adverse effect rather than an adverse effect on the historic district. So, if there's conversations that could be had ahead of time between the DOT and the SHPO and maybe some other, larger state partners who would be consulting parties on these types of projects, to come up with some maybe standard agreements on, how do you pave, a rail to trail kind of thing, or, what amenities are okay to put on it if it's a historic trail. So I think that would be my recommendation. And I understand that that's a big lift, but, if you know that you're going to do a lot of sidewalk projects, it might be worth having the conversation now rather than individually.
Yeah, one of the things I'm seeing now, we passed the bill. It's out there. We're not cutting checks today or tomorrow. FHWA has 2 speeds, glacial pace and lightning. And we're now through the lightning of the bill, but now it's this kind of glacial pace before we start writing checks, and you're starting to see this, which is why I like to say you're not going to see 1,000 projects in construction this summer, 5 to 7 years out. Let's look at that time frame. But now is the time that what I am seeing is what you would expect logically when you think about this. The bill has been passed. Everyone knows it's out there with this big dollar figure. Now is when the state legislature and the governors are saying, what projects do we want to put on our list? So what I'm recommending, we have our stips and tips, but we all know they're politically motivated with, what legislatures want to fund and what governors want to do, and the DOTs, is at the staff level for the cultural resource people to stay attuned and keep abreast of those conversations. Find out what priorities your state legislature is leaning towards. Find out what priorities your governor is leaning towards, so you can get ahead of the game and say, ooh, we've got a hot list of 15 bridges we know are going to have to get dealt with in the next 5 years. Or, wow, our governor wants to focus on main streets, and we've got 35 towns with main streets that the governor wants to focus small projects on. So listen now to what your legislature, the head of your DOT, and the governor's office are thinking, because 6 months from now is when they're going to be, making those stip and tip amendments to prioritize projects in your state. And if you can get ahead of that or keep, abreast of those conversations, then you'll be better prepared to know how to move the program to effectively manage what's going to be coming in terms of the dearth of new projects.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Jeff Plunkett, I think you might be sharing your screen. Oh, thanks. Sorry. Yeah, that's some good advice, and I think that's something, it is hard to get out of that, like Anthony said, the churn of projects, but that's really important for us to think about the future and the pipeline. We say that a lot, but that is something we do need to think about, and what that will mean, and the types of projects we might see, and how we best handle that. We have a lot of, we have a robust program here in Indiana, and we have all we have our local projects, our DOT projects, big projects, and some of those smaller projects can be some of our most controversial sometimes. But luckily, we do find a way usually to avoid the advisory council needing to step in. But I do want, for Mandy, when you look at projects, when we notify you of projects, or you find out about projects, what are some of the factors that lead you and lead the advisory council to join consultation?
Yeah, so in the regs, there's an Appendix A that lays out some of the criteria that we would look to decide whether we're participating in the project. And that's something like, if a tribe asks us to get involved, or if there's procedural issues, or, some large controversy and substantial impacts, so honestly, we could probably fit anything into one of those 4 categories. We do, there's no algorithm, there's no formula. It's basically, a discussion. If I hear that, the project might be controversial, I check in with the SHPO to see how they're doing, or a TIPO if they're involved. A lot of times if everything's going smoothly, there's no need for us to get involved at all. I know in some of the higher profile projects, I know we participated in the North Split project. That was decided before I got there. And I think that was maybe due to some early controversy that had really largely dwindled by the time I got involved. And that sometimes does happen where, we might decide to participate, and we might still sign the agreement document, but, things will sort themselves out. There's also instances where we've said, no, it looks fine, and then had to revisit whether we participate based on, some complaints from a consulting party or something like that. Full disclosure, at the end of the day, I am the lone Fed Highway liaison at the advisory council. So 50 states plus territories, there's no way for us to get involved in everything. We certainly do try to help where we can. But I'm again not going to name names, but David and I know where the problem children are. And right now, Indiana just really isn't one of them. So, I might be neglecting you guys. Don't take it personally, but it seems like you guys are doing pretty good there.
Yeah, and I'd say, think of it like a spectrum in some regards. When we had the North Split, big EIS, very complicated. The council participated, but we worked through all the challenges. And major EIS projects are a brunt of certain ones the council participates. There are times where we ask the council to participate, mainly if we think we're going to end up in court.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't go to court alone. You come with me. But on the other end of the spectrum, let's talk about Lakes County Bridge replacement project in Indiana, a locally administered tiny little project that's caused us a lot of headaches and is still active and out there. So that's the other end of the spectrum. Small, locally administered project on a historic bridge that's had enough challenges to where the council's participating. We've spent a lot of time and that's still not resolved. So there's a spectrum and you think about things in between. But know that the Federal Highway Administration can also request the participation of the council when we need to or feel like we want to. But Mandy's right. There's only two of us. I'm an FPO. I don't have staff. And, a lot of our time is just going from putting out one fire to go put out the next fire. And Indiana is not a place right now that we are spending a lot of time because the program is well managed, well run. We're not in court, not getting sued. And I think the only thing on our docket for Indiana besides the eligibility dispute is Lakes County Bridge. I think that's the only one. We do keep a docket, a list of all of our active cases that we have across the country, so that you've only got one for Indiana, and that's reflective of a good, well-run program.
And great, that's good to know. And in some projects, and I guess at the North Split, I think we had a lot of controversy at the beginning, and we had another project in Madison, which is a National Historic Landmark historic district, and I think that was another one of those where we thought at the very beginning, let's ask the advisory council to participate at the beginning instead of like when we had the adverse effect. So I think we kind of that's something else. If that's okay with you, Mandy, if that strategy works, we kind of reserve inviting the advisory council unless like the one in Madison or the North Split, unless we just know there's a lot of controversy. It is kind of that procedural step. And then at that point, we expect the advisory council wouldn't participate because it's handled. We've went through the process. It looks good. Everybody's on board. So we do think, we see that usually the advisory council would not participate.
Yeah, and I have been trying to find some middle ground too for some of the projects where, we might not have the time and capacity to formally participate, but there are some projects where, I'll attend the consulting party meetings and they'll send me the information just so that I stay on top of it in case there's an issue. And that's always something that, I'm willing to do too. We just call it offering like technical assistance.
Yeah, what do we call that?
Technical assistance.
Use that term. You can ask for technical assistance from the council without their formal participation because we have a liaison there. So that is another tool in the toolbox.
Oh, thank you. Okay, that's great to know. Thanks.
Yeah.
Just for the record, since we're being recorded, I do want to correct one thing. I believe the North Split was an EA project with a fund.
EA. Okay.
So, not EIS, thankfully. but point taken. Same point. So, David, this question is for you. We were wondering if you could talk a little bit about what factors you consider when deciding how you will take or whether you will take an eligibility disagreement to the keeper of the register.
Oh, that's an easy one. I have this little rock right here, and I just kind of flip it in the air, and if it lands on one side, we go one way. No. That's a good question, and I would like to offer. There's a whole bunch of people in the Teams meeting to ask questions too. I see everyone else is quiet. That I'll give you my government answer. That is subjective to the nature of the undertaking and the Section 106 resource in question that may or may not be eligible. Historic resources in Indiana look very different than a lot of ones we look at in Arizona, Hawaii, and Rhode Island. and we reserve the maximum flexibility within the regulations to look at them subjectively. There are a few instances where we want to go to the keeper, and two in particular. One is the case we have in Indiana, where you have a historic resource that if you ask 10 archaeologists or 10 architectural historians, you'll get 5 and 5. And it's literally a flip of the coin. Those things we like to go to the keeper to set precedents. Just give us a decision on this, keeper, so now we can move forward, because I got 15 other projects with a similar resource coming down the pipeline. So to set precedents, we will go to the keeper, and those are instances when it is a little bit of a in the gray. And the case you have in Indiana, I reviewed that entire write-up. It was very well written between the DOT, the consultants, and the SHPO, and I see the points on both sides. I did not agree with the DOT, the consultant, or the SHPO. I thought you all made such valid, good arguments that I was not willing to pass judgment from where I sit as a FPO. And in that instance, we go to the keeper, and I let them sort it out, because that is an academic exercise at this point on whether or not that historic districts fits your multiple property definition context and those other components of the eligibility determination. It was tough for me, because when those districts are potentially eligible under A and C, I lean one way, but when it's only eligible under A, it's a little harder to make that call. And that's why I was like, we need to go to the keeper on this one. So sometimes when it's in the grays, that's a good rationale to set precedents. Another time in opposition to that, when I think it's appropriate to go to the keeper, is when it's the opposite. Instead of being in the middle in the grays and we want set precedents, it's a blatant black and white issue. And I need to make the DOT or the SHPO aware of what our stance is in terms of whether or not something is eligible, in terms of being challenged by either a DOT or SHPO. And we have had that come up where I've said, this is blatantly not eligible, or this is blatantly eligible. And either the DOT or SHPO is in such opposition that I'm like, no, we're going to the keeper so we can kind of make the law of the land set, that moving forward, these types of properties are either eligible or not. When a DOT consultant or the SHPO takes a hardline stance that the Federal Highway Administration is in opposition to. Those are two of the most likely scenarios where it's either stuck in the gray in the middle and I want to set precedents, or it's off in crazy land and I need to just draw that hard line in the sand. Because sometimes the keeper is like, why are you sending this to me, David? This is so obvious. And I'm like, because I need you to kind of draw that line in the sand and be declarative. And other times they're like, for Indiana, they're like, oh, why'd you send us this Indiana one? This is so tough. We're going to struggle with this one. Hey, that's your job, keeper. Set precedents. I need a decision on this. That's at least from where I sit, my rationale.
Oh, that's great. That's really helpful. Categorization of it. Yeah. And I second your motion for please, audience, chime in. This is a great opportunity to ask questions.
And so everyone's aware, I discuss eligibility determinations with the council and with Mandy, but Mandy always likes to say, hey, that's not me. I can kind of stay out of this one. But be aware, we talk about them. We discuss them.
Yeah. We try not to step on the Park Service's toes. I mean, if there was an instance where you were trying to resolve something informally and you wanted the advisory council to help weigh in on that consultation, that's fine. But we stay out of that realm that the keeper is in.
And I engage the advisory council because honestly, a lot of eligibility determination disputes, pending the result, may end up in an effect dispute. So I need to prepare the council in case, hey, if the keeper says this is eligible, I may be coming back with a no adverse effect, and I'm going to have to argue that. So I need to keep the council involved and engaged in those eligibility disputes because they may end up in effect disputes pending the resolution of eligibility determination.
Well,
David, I was just going to say, David, sending that stuff to the keeper can sometimes actually streamline the process. I know that it does add time, but I will say generally the effect disputes that I have seen would have benefited from a better identification and evaluation process. So a lot of times we've gotten an effect dispute where the SHPO and the DOT might not have fully agreed on what the character defining elements of the historic property are. So then it's hard to say, do you have a visual impact on architectural features from a sidewalk project if you don't know, what the historic district's character defining features are? Am I saying that right, David? You know what I mean?
So yeah,
sometimes,
I'll give you
sorting out the first step helps prevent an effect dispute later.
So I'll give you a real life example that I can talk about. We had a project in Oklahoma along Route 66, Route 66 historic road, had them go back and do a better eligibility determination with the Park Service because it wasn't well done. They're like, well, we assume it's eligible. It's along Route 66. It's all historic. It's a district. And what we got into problems with in the effect dispute were the contributing elements. So sometimes, as Manny said, it helps to go through the eligibility dispute with the keeper so you don't have
I think that's a fantastic, that's such an important point, I think, because, if the definition of an adverse effect is the project's diminishment of the historic property's integrity, and integrity is the ability of the historic property to convey its significance, then in order to know whether a project will have an adverse effect, you really have to have a deep understanding of the significance, right? Which comes out sometimes through consensus with SHPO and sometimes through this process of debate and back and forth where you really suss out, okay, is it A, is it C, what areas of significance, what's the period of significance too. That's fantastic point that, sometimes gets lost in our rush to get things done, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, good points. So, when we have our big our EIS level projects, it's easier to get public involvement in the process because, we're having, newspaper articles, Twitter, feeds, public workshops, meetings, advertisements, all these things, CAC meetings, all these different avenues. But, I think where we're struggle with is usually our smaller projects. How do we get the public involved, and how do you reach out and because really a newspaper notice doesn't really seem like it cuts it anymore, as much as it might have in the past. So do you all have any recommendations or examples of public outreach, engagement, and try to get the general public involved in 106 projects?
Yeah, I'll start. There's a very concise term the Federal Highway Administration is promoting. And we have websites on this. We have some guidance documents on this. It's extremely relevant. And this is the terminology I would prefer you to use. It's a NEPA term, but I'd like it to bleed into 106 compliance. VPI, virtual public involvement. Ever since the pandemic started, we have just gone whole hog on VPI in terms of I want it on a website. I want it on Facebook. I want it on YouTube, Twitter, in addition to the newspaper, the mailings, and independent of the pandemic, going to the community church after church to talk about the project in that urban environment, going to the PTA meeting, going to, venues to reach out to the public, and as well as public workshop components in terms of for your NEPA public workshops having a 106 component. But VPI is the big thing we're promoting, and utilizing the digital information that we can promote through virtual public involvement in the 106 realm in a multifaceted arena of social media and information in terms of every state DOT website should be very dynamic and interactive. And if yours is not, it's something you should be recommending to your IT, PR, and leadership so that the public can go on the internet to your website and find all your project information. You should be recommending and promoting your SHPO have the same, as well as other entities involved in the NEPA process. But virtual public engagement involvement is the big thing we're promoting. And that's what I see as the best course of action, with the idea that it is subjective and contextual to the geographic locale you're in. There are certain portions in northeastern Montana where that is irrelevant because they don't have the broadband width to handle that, and you still got to snail mail things or physically go to places in rural areas or on tribal lands. So you have to be cognizant of where you are in the world. But I see VPI as being the best avenue, in addition to the tried and true methods and tools we have in our box to reach out for public engagement. I've also seen some positive relationships anew with schools and universities, because students at universities and schools have students that have families, and those families may be wanting to be engaged on projects. So there's no reason why you can't go to a university or high school and have a flyer or a mailer about a project in that town or that county they may want to be aware about or tell their parents about. So using those local institutions, public libraries, and all those other entities. But because of the pandemic, so much has been more virtual that we've really focused on social media. Even the advisory council utilizes your Twitter feed extensively, because I keep getting bombarded with all those council tweets and trying to keep up with all of them daily. But that's my experience. And Mandy, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, the 106 regs don't prescribe like a way to do your outreach, just that it's commensurate with, your project and its impact. So I, totally support David's advice as far as using all the virtual platforms possible. I'm old school. I buy a newspaper maybe once a week at best. I don't know if anybody's reading those ads anymore. So I imagine most people are getting their information from Twitter or Facebook or, whatever the latest trend is. So, I would certainly encourage you to be creative, work with your PR department to piggyback on, whatever they're doing too, to so that you're not reinventing the wheel or, creating a whole new website just for cultural resources or something. There might be ways to piggyback that into, NEPA and other project notifications.
Yep. Thank you. Yeah, those are great ideas.
All right. So moving on to another topic here. Some of our more challenging situations occur when the Section 106 process and the NEPA process in general concludes, and then for whatever reason, the project is delayed, put on hold, it changes, and then years later, we get, a notification, oh, this project is back on. And we have to decide under what circumstances do we reopen the process and how do we reopen the process? And I understand this is kind of a big question, and it really depends on the circumstances, the specifics in terms of what level of documentation might be needed to address that kind of situation. But maybe you could each talk about what general principles or ideas or guidance you would have for that type of situation.
So I'll start, and I'll tee up Mandy on a specific question I have for Mandy. But as we know, NEPA regulations are pretty concise about a reevaluation for NEPA. We know what a reevaluation is for NEPA. We know how to do it. We know what it should look like, and we're pretty good about that. Unfortunately, we're not good with the 106 regulations. And the question for Mandy is, what do the regulations say about, and I'll use the NEPA term, reevaluation. But in the 106 world, we do struggle with this in terms of what is adequate documentation for, and I'll use that term, reevaluation. But the reality is, Our agency is very different than federal land management agencies, Park Service, BLM, Forest Service, as well as other funding agencies. We're very different than the Corps and FEMA and FERC in that it's quite often we have a project. It gets through 106. It may have an agreement document, may or may not sign a NEPA document, and then the project falls into cryostasis and it's frozen in time. And it's normally because of political winds of a legislature or governor wanting or not wanting to fund something. It sits on that shelf. We have a very bad habit of doing that, but that's the reality. And those projects come off the shelf 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And we're pretty good about, oh, NEPA reevaluation, go into it. We know what we need. 106, we know we got to look at the above ground stuff again, but what's that documentation level? How far back in the 106 process do we go? Do I got to go back to step 1 and reinitiate consultation? Do I got to go back just to step 2 and re-identify? Are there new 106 consulting parties? And these are questions we wrestle with, and the documentation standards, we don't have a good concise of the expectation of what that looks like when we kind of do have a better handle on that for NEPA. So it is a challenge, and we do struggle with that. And I'll ask Mandy to opine on the regulations and how they speak to that. But in my purview is to ask those initial questions of how far back in the 4-step process do I need to go? If nothing has changed in project design and we have an MOA with mitigation commitments, yes, I may need to go back to make sure there's nothing new that is potentially eligible in consulting parties. But if I have an existing agreement document that's still valid, I just may need to brush it off, amend it, and then implement it. Or maybe I do need to go all the way back to step 1 because it's been 20 years, the regs have changed, the laws have changed, and I need to just start over. It's subjective, but you have to kind of, in my opinion, ask yourself all those internal questions, discuss it with the SHPO and TIPO, whoever the official with jurisdictions are, and come up with a consensus on how far back in the 4-step process. And then once you're back to wherever you think you need to be, you're kind of going through that process again. There is no different process. There is no different standard. It's just how far back in the process and then going through those steps. We see it quite often with amendments to MOAs or PAs because you have to account for new properties. But 80% of the MOA is still valid and half the mitigation is still valid. I've just got to change and add a few things. So there's an amendment process. But it's more just internally asking yourself those questions and thinking about how far back. But it is a challenge, and I don't have good, clear, concise guidance or facts or Q&As because it is kind of subjective to the nature of things. And I'll stop there and ask Mandy to weigh in.
Yeah, I totally agree. It really depends. If you have a project that has an executed agreement document, these days we're putting sunset clauses on them. So, you might have an expired one or not. It depends. Some of the project PAs we put together have like 25-year shelf lives. Some of them have 5. So, but, even if a project goes on a shelf, if you have an executed agreement document, whether it's a project PA or an MOA, if there are annual reporting clauses in there, I don't think putting it on a shelf as a project precludes you from, continuing to put together those annual reports. And the benefit of that is that you're providing these reports to your consulting parties. And even if it just says, hey, we're putting the project on hold and we're not doing anything for the next year, you're reassuring them that you haven't forgotten about them, that you're still thinking about them, that you're going to get back at them when you're going to have this project up and moving again. I think, when we see a lot of angst from consulting parties, it's because there's been radio silence for so long on something, and that they think that you're doing something nefarious behind closed doors, when honestly you're not. You're just working on other projects, right? So I think, I would really encourage you to continue using those annual reporting clauses, even if it's just a paragraph to tell your consulting party parties like, hey, this is what's going on. We'll get back to you next year with another update, or we'll let you know when it starts moving again. And then when it does start moving again, if you've been consulting with, been informing them all along what's going on, then you can not necessarily pick up at square one, but you can do like, okay, is our APE still valid? Provide that to them if it is, not necessarily like redoing the whole thing. And then, okay, well, it's only been, 5 years and SHPO might be okay with 5-year-old reports, but if it's been 10 years, they might not. We might have to look at that a little closer. So that really comes through in the consultation process too. We see, different levels of comfort with SHPO offices. And I'm not saying one's better than the other, but, definitely checking in with them just to make sure, that the survey methods are still valid for today based on, what was done at the time. David brought up a good point about additional consulting parties. There might be new groups that have formed in the meantime, and that's okay. You can bring them into it and just say, hey, this is what we've done. Here's our information to date. You're welcome to consult with things going forward, but that doesn't mean you have to go back to square one either. So I guess my big takeaway from that would just be, just remind your consulting parties that you haven't forgot them, and they won't think you're doing anything scandalous that's, trying to get away with something.
Yeah, that's a great point, because we get that a lot on projects that sit, they're really thinking something's going on and we're moving forward without talking to people, and it's really like, no, it's just nothing's happening. Well, and I think that kind of is a good segue into really our next question, which is really about how we track, monitor MOA compliance, because we have our DOT projects, we have our local projects, and we are trying to track all of those. And there's different levels of some of these where consultants have handed it off to the locals. They've handed it off completely. They were just doing the 106 and they're out of it now. And then so we have different ways we do that. We have a project commitments database. We also do a quarterly assurance review in our office where we look at those projects, go out in the field to see, did they do the MOA compliance? So we're trying to continually improve that process. And one thing I could see too is on our MOAs is that reporting clause. I think that's a great idea for us to implement on some of these projects. And but what do you all see out there, and what do you have recommendation, and what is some recommendations you all have for tracking those, and maybe even also just how you implement, how you initially implement them in an MOA to make sure that they're carried forward?
So I can start with a few things. So the first thing to be cognizant, Section 106 agreement documents, these are federally, legally binding agreements. Again, these are legally binding agreements the federal government has committed to do with mitigation. So the state is liable because you're signing it. I am liable because the federal government is signing it. So the challenge is a lot of places you sign the Section 106 MOA and just put it in a drawer and forget about it. No, it should be taped up on the wall in front of you, because that is a legally binding federal agreement. And if you break that agreement or you don't fulfill that agreement, you're in violation of federal law. And the risk is very high to end up in court. And we do have that happen. And that's what I don't want to see. So inherently, there's, again, I'll talk about a spectrum. On one end of the spectrum, I've got some Post-it notes on my office wall about mitigation commitments and projects that I know we still got to put the rocks in a box and get them to the museum or do that brochure. And, hey, that's something. Is that great? No, but it's something. Succession planning rolls into this. As Mandy said, our agreements can go 5, 10, 20, 30 years. Are you going to be here in 30 years to remind people about that mitigation commitment? No. How's your succession planning to hand that off? Are you going to take those Post-it notes off your office wall and give them to somebody? So the other end of the spectrum is states and programs that have, electronic database tracking mechanisms, or embedded within their statewide PA, an annual reporting mechanism that requires you once a year to have at least a discussion or provide a graphic, an Excel file chart about, here are all the agreement documents we have, here's the status, here's the ones we've closed, 106 does not have a formal closeout process. So I'd like to recommend when you conclude 106, you should be sending a closeout memo to the SHPO and the Federal Highway Administration. We have fulfilled all the mitigation per this date. Here's our closeout memo. So you can close the books. But having annual reporting requirements in your statewide PA, or just setting up an annual meeting with the Federal Highway and the SHPO to let's talk about our body of active agreement documents and the status of the mitigation commitments. And, I've said it before and I'll say it again, but the Lake County Bridge project is still out there in the ethers. And that's still on our books that we're, watching. And that's still one we know we've got to conclude. So, reporting requirements, you can have Excel files to manage this. I've had people say, well, I'll just put a bunch of things on my Outlook calendar to remind me. Oh, well, that's great. And what about when you retire in 15 years? Are you going to give someone the Outlook calendar? No, that is not an effective way to manage this. But what I have found is some interesting things. A number of SHPOs have database management programs because of their reporting requirements for the Park Service or other scenarios. They may be watching and managing agreement documents. So coordinating with SHPOs. I like to say it's a trifecta. If the DOT has a system or some way, shape, or form to track this, if the SHPO does, and if our Federal Highway Administration Division Office does, between those three entities, nothing should slip through the cracks. And if at the very least you have an annual meeting to talk about this stuff, it's still going to stay at the forefront no matter who changes jobs, succession planning, or projects that end up in cryostasis and you forget about because they never go to construction or they're on hold. Because those agreement documents are legally binding, that's such a big deal. This is a challenge, and we see a spectrum of how states are handling this in different scenarios. And I like to say, if you're a place where you've just got Post-it notes on the wall, let's try and move that needle a little bit farther. Start with an Excel file or some system, but we allow max flexibility to whatever works for the state. So we don't prescribe one method or another. We just say, do it good, do it better, with the intent that if our division office, our state DOT counterparts, and our SHPOs are all in some way, shape, or form looking at this, then we should be okay. But with all that being said, there are places and cases where we are challenged and we're in court for noncompliance or for broach of federal agreements because the agreement expired and we never fulfilled the mitigation. And that's another point. If a Section 106 agreement expires, you cannot amend it. It is done. And if you haven't fulfilled the mitigation, you are in direct risk of, having a legal challenge to it. So it behooves you to manage those, knowing that currently we require a sunset clause or duration component to all the agreement documents, so they can't be left open forever and ever. We just did a big nationwide analysis of this topic and internally, and it's important and it is a challenge for states. Mandy?
Yeah, I don't have too much to add just because, the regs don't prescribe a way of doing it. I certainly echo David's advice as far as, tracking that, in any way you can. I mean, and every state should be given the flexibility to do it the way they want. I do want to be clear, though, that it is, ultimately the Federal Highway Administration's responsibility for tracking this. So, as much as there are some SHPOs.
Hey, I'm always left holding the bag at the end of the day.
But hey, you're the federal agency. So, as much as I do think you should be working with your SHPO partners, and I get the impression that the SHPO office in Indiana is very organized, it should be an initiative ultimately led by, or at least, followed closely by Fed Highway. Not that other parties aren't capable of doing it. I'm not saying that, Indiana has to do this necessarily, but David, I would be curious if you also recommend Hawaii has a really good way of doing closeout memos where, they send, and they do it for the big projects, like even by stipulation, where they document when the meetings took place that addressed that particular item, and then includes pictures or whatever of how that item, whether it's an interpretive panel that's installed or, something like that. And some of them ended up being a couple pages, but it was a really thorough documentation of how those stipulations were complied with. And in this case, with this particular project, there were some consulting party questions about, whether certain mitigations were completed or not. So I find that to be a really helpful way of doing it, but maybe not necessarily for every tiny project, but for the big ones, I thought that was really good. David, I'm talking about the Queen K Highway.
Yeah, one thing that I learned through that project in Hawaii that I recommend Indiana DOT is go talk to your construction folks in the project delivery and say, when you finish construction, I know you do a final inspection. How do you document that? How do you document your closeout of construction? And if they have an internal SOP or practice, you could just cut and paste and adopt it and say, if this is how we close out through documentation with the con phase, maybe we do it in the NEPA phase or the 106 phase. So at least your language and verbiage is consistent internally within your office. And see, how do you document completion of right-of-way, the right-of-way phase, or the design phase? When you get final design, there's some kind of memo. And that's where I see states do it different, but states like to all do it within the state the same way. And I see the con phase leading some of those discussions on the verbiage, or having forms or templates for quote-unquote, what I like to say, closeout memos. But I like doing that because then the SHPO has it on file, and our office and our division has something on file, so that, as Manny said, when the consulting party is like, did you ever really finish that thing? You can say, aha, I've got the documentation. Then the official with jurisdiction concurred with it, SHPO or, TIPO, because that is quite common. That comes up, especially on these legacy 20, 30-year-old projects. It's like, did we ever finish that brochure, that curation? Did we ever complete the context sensitive solution design we were supposed to do? Yeah. And the fact that you are inheriting projects from your predecessors because you weren't in that job 25 years ago when they signed the MOA and made those commitments, and you're stuck fulfilling them. That's a huge problem I have, where people are like, look, I didn't agree to this. Someone 25 years ago agreed to do this. How do I implement it? That's always a challenge.
Yeah, those are great points. And yeah, we relate to some of that for sure.
I think that's, one of those things where you hope that the people 10 years from now will recognize the efforts we've made today to try to make their job easier. I think, which leads me to one question related to this. Do you have any advice for crafting mitigation stipulations that to make that job easier down the road, without compromising on mitigation? But sometimes we find that the way that a stipulation is written can make it harder or more difficult to track down the road.
Yeah, and Mandy and I could talk for hours on this, because this is a big part of our portfolio of challenges we deal with. I'm given an agreement document from 1987 on a project, and it says, for mitigation for adverse effects, I'm going to do something for somebody in the future for some dollar figure. That's all it says. And I'm like, what? That's ridiculous. Who signed this agreement? It was 20, 30 years ago. We have that. We have that quite often. My recommendation, concise and specific and declarative and definitive. And if you need to go so far, there are ways we can put numbers in agreements. No more than $250,000 will be spent on this component of the mitigation. We are going to produce no more than 200 brochures and booklets. We're going to only up to level 1 HABs hair. Be as specific as you can, so there's no interpretation of what the mitigation could have been. And anytime I see an agreement document that's like, for mitigation, we could do one of these 10 items. No, decide now what those items are. Don't leave it up. And if you can't get consensus because the consulting parties, the SHPO and the TIPO are like, well, we want these 10 different things. We don't want. That's not a good agreement. You shouldn't be assigning. We shouldn't be agreeing to something like that. I have to look out for the public expenditure of public dollars, the expenditure of public funds. That is not a fiduciary good thing to be doing with a lot of money. So, be declarative, be singular in nature. This is exactly what the mitigation is. And if you can't get consensus, then elevate that as a challenge. Look, the consulting parties in the SHPO are willing to agree to some of these 10 items, so we're just going to put them all in the agreement and figure it out later. No, that is bad. Do not punt. Elevate the issue up the chain of command so that the decision making is declarative in the agreement. These are federally binding legal agreements that have fiduciary components that we are liable for. And as Mandy said, at the end of the day, FHWA is left holding the bag. That's why I want to see concise. And there are many instances where a state DOT and consultants working on their behalf have challenges getting consensus on that type of mitigation. Those are the things that should be elevated to where Mandy and I can get involved, provide a national perspective, and get to a point where what we consider is compensatory mitigation. What is compensatory to the adverse effect to the historic property, and say, well, you've got 10 things on your menu, but we only think 3 of them are compensatory, and be declarative. These are the 3 things we're getting for mitigation. At the end of the day, it's the decision of the Federal Highway Administration, and we take that seriously, and we don't have a problem getting involved in project-specific agreement documents, because we'd rather sign declarative things and leave them loosey-goosey and open-ended and vague to interpretation. That becomes problematic, especially if it's something like, we're going to commit to preserve another bridge, but you don't say how long. Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? And then it could get demolished? That's not good. That's not concise, declarative, definitive mitigation kind of language. Same thing with displays. Oh, we're going to do a museum display in this place. That's great. Are you paying for how long is it going to be there? Is it in perpetuity? Am I tied to that forever and ever? And then when the building has water damage, I've got to pay for that? Just, you've got to think about those kind of what if scenarios to be very declarative. And frankly, that's where we do end up with a lot of challenges on our end, are things that are vague in agreement documents that aren't well written.
Yeah, David, I think you're absolutely right about specificity. I encountered an MOA from I think it was the 80s in California, where they built an interpretive building for a bridge replacement project. And decades later, this building now needs to be moved, and Fed Highway is still on the hook for it because it's not specific enough in the agreement document. There's no sunset clause. So now they have to rebuild this somewhere else. And they're doing the right thing, don't get me wrong, but oh my goodness, now they're on the hook for something this long. That's a lot. So, specificity is certainly an important thing about this. But I also want to take it a little further and say, it's great, when you have, I'll use your North Split project, for instance. You had very robust consultation, many meetings to develop that agreement document, and a lot of stakeholder input. And, what I really like seeing, and I've seen a couple emails since, where there's a continued engagement with those consulting parties as that agreement document is implemented. And I think it's really important because, you might have really well-meaning consultants who you give these tasks to, but they might not have been part of those consulting party meetings early on. So they might not have heard what people were really envisioning for that brochure or that interpretive panel. So, I think it's really important that as the agreement document is implemented, that you still have those consultation meetings so that there isn't a disagreement later of, well, yeah, you did those 10 interpretive panels, but they don't say anything that our community wanted them to say. So, we want to make sure that there's involvement throughout the whole process. And, even if it's having the consulting parties review the, drafts of the narratives that's going to be in that brochure or whatever, just so that you're making sure that you're giving them what they asked for too, as much as possible. So I guess that would be my advice on that point.
Yeah, thank you. Does we have David and Mandy here, so before we wrap up, does anybody out there have questions? This is a great opportunity. So please, you folks out there, please, if you have any questions, This is it. This is the time. Now you can't ask us later. Next week, you can't ask us. This is the. Just kidding, but like.
Well,
Quiet.
if
There's
no
a
one-
hand up. Someone's got
Oh
a hand.
yeah. Oh,
Who is
oh,
that?
Oh,
This is me. This is David Moffa with INDOT. I was wondering, we've been hearing, I'm an archaeologist, we've been hearing a lot about the mid-century above ground structures and all the challenges that go along with. Have you seen an increase in the mid-century archaeological sites and in other states? And is that becoming an issue as well?
So I'll start. There is one state and one state DOT archaeologist who we love, who
Just
keeps
name it.
keeps bringing this up. Scott in Oklahoma, mid 20th century archaeology, and he's been very concerned. And the focus nationally, from a trends perspective, is still on mid 20th century architecture. And I've been kind of pushing off the mid 20th century archaeology because of just don't really want to deal with that. But it's starting to burble up more and more, and it's in your world. It's in mid-America. It's Indiana, Illinois, Oklahoma, Missouri, and that's where we're going to get it. And I think to get ahead of the curve, now would be a time to have some high-level theoretical, academic, philosophical discussions with the SHPO, to think in your state, hey, we need to be prepared for this. Can we start thinking about whether it's context documents or how we want to or not want to handle this? Because, there are places around the country, including Indiana, where it's like, if I got to look at another bunch of early 20th century whiteware, I'm going to shoot myself in the head. So you need to be thinking about, styrofoam Burger King Big Mac containers and other mid 20th century things pertinent to Indiana, and then from a consensus with the SHPO how that you plan to handle these. And frankly, those discussions are not happening because states are focusing on the mid 20th century architecture. But I recommend you think about that too. And there is not a lot of good information, guidance, or anything out on this, except for Oklahoma being the one kind of screaming at the window right now. And by all means, reach out to Scott and then the folks in Oklahoma and talk to them, see how they're struggling with it.
I've talked about this actually, and it's a huge percentage of the sites that they're documenting. I'm glad that we don't have the issue that they're having right now.
You will. It will come.
Elizabeth, you had your hand up. You want to chime in?
Sure. Hi. Going back to some of the mitigation measures that David was talking about, specifically the having some kind of curated exhibit, or with historic bridges, committing to preserving another bridge. Those are two types of mitigation that I've had kind of vetoed in the last couple of years. I remember one of the reasons being with an exhibit, whether you have to have somewhere to put the exhibit, and then that kind of puts the onus on them to be contributing. Do you have any advice for those kind of things, or how you would make sure that happens, I guess?
I would I'll be quick, think logically and realistically that you can't commit to have an exhibit in perpetuity forever. You can't preserve a bridge somewhere else forever. So for bridges, think about lifespan. Is the mitigation to rehab and commit to preserve the historic bridge for at least 50 years? Hey, I got 50 years out of it. Be realistic. Nothing's in perpetuity. Same thing with museum displays and stuff like that. Be realistic. it's not forever and forever, at least 10 years, at least 20 years. Negotiate on the specificity of some of those finite things so you have an end game and that you don't leave it open-ended, loosey-goosey, because those are the traps that we fall into and get challenged on. And the other thing, that you're not alone. Everyone else in the country struggles with this. So reach out to others. Reach out through SAA, SHA, ACRA, ASHTO, call a colleague, query Mandy and I from a national perspective, phone a friend, reach out. Someone else has probably dealt with this and figured out a way to solution it. So definitely.
Well, great. Thank you so much. We should be respectful of your time and wrap up here. We're at time. Are there any parting words of wisdom you'd like to share?
I'll go back to what I started with. Hold on to the seat of your pants with the bill. And thank you for allowing us the opportunity to be engaged with all the folks in Indiana. I thought this was great. And, as Mandy and I had stated, you got a great program. We don't have legal challenges, so you're not going to see us that often or hear from us, but that doesn't preclude you from reaching out to us. If you have questions, if you have concerns, one of the big things that we like to propone, just like our predecessors, Mary Ann and Carol Lagarde, we are here. We can provide a national perspective. We can do technical guidance that's not official. We can opine on things. We can provide best practices and recommendations. So even though we're not directly involved in your program and projects, we're always here to provide assistance. And thank you.
Yeah, I'll just echo what David said, reach out if anybody has any questions, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this.
Well, thank you all. You all have been great, and we really appreciate your time. We know this is, such a busy time of year, but we really appreciate your time, and we know it's very special that you gave us your time, and we learned a lot. So thank you all very much.
Happy holidays, everyone.
Yep.
Happy holidays.
Everybody. Thank you all. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Mandy and David. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks.